McCarthyism, a vociferous campaign against alleged communists in the U.S. government and other institutions carried out under Senator Joseph McCarthy in the period 1950 through 1954.
Today, the most dangerous enemy agent is not so much concerned with the secret information about weapons as he is with infiltrating the necessary departments of the government and shaping and controlling the actions of our nation so that the enemy is progressively winning without even firing a single shot. Now, I intend to name names. John S. Service. And remember that name, if you will.
I have never knowingly transmitted any information which was, shall we say, secret military plans.
Service was hounded out of the State Department.
I had trouble renting homes, renting an apartment in New York. And the companies, well, what will our stockholders say, you know? So the companies that I had known and had dealings with abroad, export companies, they said, sorry, we think you're a fine guy, but we don't dare touch you.
One communist. One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many.
Welcome to the Business Intercept, channel dedicated to finding interesting business news that you don't have time to discover, breaking economic news, and then provide, I hope, plain analysis on what it could mean for you from a Main Street level. I'll be posting content throughout the week, depending on the news of the day. If you like what you hear and see, I hope you will subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share it. If you have a question or comment for me or any of the guests that I interview, be sure to comment below. One of my goals, or better said, guiding principles for the Business Intercept is to zero in on business news or other news that may have implications for the economy or work. It's not a channel about how to make a fortune from YouTube or stocks or real estate or internet marketing. There are plenty of channels for that. It is also, for the most part, not a political channel. It is not meant to be, which for irony's sake means, of course, that the first couple of stories are highly political. America was poised to move into a slow but steady recovery mode from the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least that was the hope. Then the killing of George Floyd occurred. Protests, riots, and looting immediately followed. Political and public pressure exploded, catapulting the activist group Black Lives Matter into the stratosphere. In this moment, they are no longer a fringe African American activist group. Black Lives Matter has created its own personhood, and you must embrace them. If you do not, if you question, criticize, or otherwise dismiss them, action against you will be lightning quick. Not unlike the Red Scare hearings of Joseph McCarthy in the early 50s, which is why I opened the video with those hearings. Dissenters will be vilified, called to public account, and have their lives ruined. Take a look at this article from Fox News that was published about 3 days ago. Delta Airlines parts ways with a flight attendant after racist tweets surface. We hear this a lot. It's not particularly new. People going into employees or famous people's Twitter feeds, going back in time and bringing out gotcha tweets that people may have, placed on Twitter or Facebook or any other social media 5, 6, 10 years ago. But this is fairly recent, and this is a normal person. It's a Delta flight attendant. So just read a couple things because this kind of illustrates where we may be going. So Delta Airlines has parted ways with a longtime flight attendant after racist tweets from the stewardesses caused a commotion on social media. The Atlanta-based carrier has parted ways with the now former employee, Kevin Jennings. I want you to take note of that name because that's going to be possibly a key point here in a second. Kevin Jennings, a spokesperson confirmed to Fox News on Friday morning, has basically been fired. They have a zero tolerance for racism, bigotry, and hateful acts, a Delta spokesperson said. So, brings to mind, what exactly did this employee say? So here's one of the post that was sent to the president of, rather the CEO of Delta Airlines. Kevin Jennings, this is the part I agree with and don't understand. Black lives only matter to black people when a white person kills one of them. Black people kill each other every day. Now, obviously, the first thing to recognize here is this is not a tweet that Kevin Jennings wrote. This is essentially a retweet, and Kevin is agreeing with it. The other thing to notice is, and I would like to zoom in here, but the particular recording software I'm using doesn't allow you to really zoom in on it. Look at that picture. That is a woman. That's not a guy. And that will be confirmed in just a moment. Right here, earlier this week, Twitter users called out the carrier for the flight attendant's hateful racist rhetoric and accused her of attacking the Black Lives Matter movement with her inflammatory posts. So this brings to mind two things. First, she's not writing the post. She's essentially retweeting it and commenting on what someone else wrote. What this particular person here, Mark, wrote is essentially the concept that Black Lives Matter and many black activists make a lot of noise, get on TV, scream and yell whenever someone black, unfortunately, is killed by law enforcement or some other situation that they don't particularly like. But when you talk to them about the number of people that are black people that are killed by other black people, when you talk to them about the simple fact that the number of black people who will be killed this year by other black people dwarfs the number of black people that will be killed by cops in general, let alone just white cops. They never want to talk about that. They don't march about that. They don't demand an answer to that question. And it's a statement that many prominent black conservatives across the country always talk about. And it's certainly something that even Democratic black people have talked about at times in terms of some activists and some local community organizers who are on the ground, so to speak. This is something they do talk about. So what Kevin is saying and agreeing with here is A, not racist, and B, is a pretty common point of contention about Black Lives Matter and has been for the last 6 or 7 years. So why would this be considered racist other than she's attacking Black Lives Matter? A corollary to this would be after the last mass shooting that occurred in this country, just like the other ones that had happened before, a lot of incendiary rhetoric came out and was said about the NRA. You know, many people went on Twitter and Facebook and essentially called the NRA and anybody that supports the NRA and anybody who's a member of the NRA of being complicit in the killing of kids. Now, if someone is an employee of Delta and a conservative finds that tweet and sends it to Delta, is Delta now going to fire the employee that agreed with that type of statement? I think many people from the middle to the right would say no. Black Lives Matter is an organization, loose organization. It's a political and activist movement. There can be no racism against a political action group or a political, movement. You can only be racist against people. Goes further. She had another tweet, and this is somewhat borderline, but I've heard it from other people, and certainly I've heard plenty of liberals making fun of Donald Trump's wife not being able to speak clear English. Of course, she speaks 6 languages, but put that aside.
So Kevin said in one, how in the name of God did a non-English speaking candidate get on the ballot? Don't you have to pass the citizens test? Or do refugees get to skip that? This is way more than outrageous. And I think she's talking to the point that if someone's going to be running for elected office, it would be nice if they understood and could speak the language that they're running for. Now, you could say that's borderline, but that's not fireable. Delta has thousands of employees. You can bet many of them are not conservative. And therefore, you can bet that they have either said, followed, retweeted, or liked some sort of outrageous statement from some crazy leftist person or some person on Twitter who says something. I mean, you go back up to this one up here. Sorry. I don't know who this guy is. I mean, it's not like it's Sean Hannity, right? He's not like known by a lot of people that I can think of within the conservative movement as far as I know. So he could be just a regular guy that she's like, that makes sense. And I keep saying her, but I'm doing that for a reason. Because far be it from me, with a name like Kiara Ashanti, to assume that a name is definitely particular to male or female. But I've never heard Kevin pronounced in such a way as it be female. And I've never seen a woman being named Kevin. So it could be that she's a transgender. It could be that she's actually a guy pretending to be a woman and hasn't changed her name, which would be interesting because then what you would have here is Black Lives Matter supporters getting mad at a transgender person who is right now one of the ultimate social justice groups. Now, I haven't been able to confirm that. As we'll see in a second here, I did email Delta for a comment and asked them a couple of questions about this particular situation, and I'll show you what their response was to me in a moment. But one of the questions I did ask was for them to confirm whether or not Kevin Jennings is a former transgender employee of Delta Airlines. So what all of this shows is really a situation where we're moving from not having the right rhetoric toward people, which if you go too far would be understandable for you to get in trouble at a large organization, to now you can't criticize political groups. Again, that would be like not being able to criticize Trump USA or Breitbart News, the NRA, the Freedom Foundation. I mean, there are any number of conservative organizations that put out tweets, stories, commentary that those on the left do not like. And they are attacked for it. Is this the new business model?
I reached out to Delta about this situation, and here is the email that I sent.
Mr. Bastion, I'm Kiara Ashanti, independent reporter, following up on Delta's decision to fire Kevin Jennings because of tweets that some found offensive and racist. First, a clarification if you could. Kevin is a male name, but other media outlets are referring to Kevin as her. Was Kevin Jennings a transgender employee? Second, a question for Delta as a company. After reading the tweets in question, do you think it is appropriate to fire employees for comments that some may call racist, but are in fact just opposite opinions? In the tweet, referencing Black Lives Matter, Kevin agreed with the statement made by someone else, a retweet of a comment that has been echoed by many commentators over the years, especially by prominent African American commentators, namely that Black Lives Matter never addresses black on black crime, the primary cause of violence within the African American community. Explain how this is appropriate. Lastly, since the creation of the Black Lives Movement, its representatives have posted tweets and other social media posts calling for violence against police, white Americans, and made other racially tinged comments. If employees who support Black Lives Matter in their own social media posts have their comments forwarded to you, as Kevin Jennings were, well, Delta takes similar action against those employees. Thank you for your time. The piece I'm producing is running on Tuesday, June 15th, 2020. That was the email that I sent. I copied the CEO and their media department. The response that I got from Delta was from an Adrian, and it was pretty short and terse. Hi, Kiara Ashanti. Please see our statement below. We have zero tolerance for racism, bigotry, and hateful acts. The posts have been removed, and the employee no longer works at Delta. I followed up with an email to their response, which was, I did in fact expect a better response than that, but just to kind of give you a flavor for what I sent to them. Adrian, thank you for responding. However, the statement put out by Delta does not answer the questions. The post did not contain racist comments, but political ones that differ from others. Clarification on this distinction would be helpful. Unless you can confirm that any critical statements regarding Black Lives Matter is considered racist by Delta.
The Delta story is not the only one in the news. Tucker Carlson highlighted two other situations in recent days. Here's what Tucker had to say.
China. It's why when Black Lives Matter tells them to take a knee, they do. It's all pretty strange when you think about it. If the leaders of Black Lives Matter are political actors, and they are, then by definition, you are allowed to have any opinion you want to have about them. Black Lives Matter wants to run the country, therefore you can freely criticize Black Lives Matter. Those are the rules of our system, but not anymore. Imagine a world where you are punished for questioning the behavior of the president or for insulting your local mayor. You probably can't imagine that. It's too bizarre. It's un-American. But that's where we are right now. Black Lives Matter has changed the rules. And here's their first new rule: no criticizing Black Lives Matter. You can be fired from your job if you disobey. Many Americans have been. On Friday, for example, the principal of a public school in Windsor, Vermont, was dismissed from her job for posting the following words on her personal Facebook page, quote, "While I understand the urgency to feel compelled to advocate for Black lives, what about our fellow law enforcement? Just because I don't walk around with a BLM sign should not mean I'm a racist," end quote. Unfortunately, the principal's boss disagreed. The superintendent of Windsor Schools described the quote you just heard as, quote, "outright racist." Windsor, Vermont, by the way, is more than 97% white. Also on Friday, an economist called Harold Uhlig lost his job at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago for daring to offer even milder criticism than that. On Twitter, Uhlig noted that Black Lives Matter had, quote, just torpedoed itself with its full-fledged support of hashtag defund the police. Now is the time, Uhlig noted, quote, for sensible adults to enter back into the room and have serious, earnest, respectful conversations about it all. That was a racist statement, the Federal Reserve concluded, so they fired Harold Uhlig. We could give you many other examples of the same thing happening. There are a lot of them.
You know, it used to be that attacking or disagreeing with a group of people, blacks, gays, transgender women, etc., could get you in the hot water. James Damore is probably the most famous situation after he was fired for a memo on Google's echo chamber and comments about women in the tech space. But we have now moved on from people and groups to political and activist organizations. The legal, PR, and business impacts could be huge. As we speak, the NFL is moving in a direction that might cause a ratings apocalypse. More important, what does it mean, well, for you? Are you sure your job and business is safe from the woke tidal wave crashing over America? On the legal front, I spoke with attorney Kay Van Way. Kay is a board-certified award-winning attorney and worked on multiple civil rights cases against Christopher Dunst, aka Dr. Death, whose All True Story became 2019's #1 nonfiction podcast. Here's Kate's interview.
I guess the easiest way to start off with is me just kind of lay a couple of examples and groundwork, and then give me what your initial reaction were to these, and then I can kind of go from there. So, for Delta, just in the last few days, let go an employee for posts that were written, I don't know, a number of different ones, but they were forwarded to the CEO. But the one that seemed to be most egregious and kick it off was a retweet that they had about criticizing Black Lives Matter. We've had a professor in, I think it's Pennsylvania, a Fed person in Pennsylvania who's also working at this university, did the same thing. Basically had a relatively benign statement about criticizing the path forward from what Black Lives Matter is doing now, and he was fired immediately. And there seems to be kind of an escalation in a different way, but what were your initial reactions to these types of stories?
Well, as a non-lawyer, just as a person, my reaction is, I think it's good to see corporations coming out publicly with what they stand for and being good corporate citizens. As a legal matter, unless an employer is discriminating against an employee based upon some protected class, race, national origin, religious freedom, things of that nature, we mostly have, or I should say in the absence of some kind of a contractual relationship, we mostly have employment at will across the board in the United States, meaning, a company is well within its rights to say, look, this is who we are and this is what we stand for, and if one of the employees does something that is not in keeping with their values, then unless they're discriminated against on one of these very narrow protected classes, then it's legal.
Okay. So it seems to be a bit of an escalation out of the beginning. Obviously, we've seen situations where there's been criticism of particular classes, just commentary. But I think the biggest example is probably James Damore over at Google with his, kind of manifesto, so to speak, that got him fired from Google. But that was talking about particular classes of people, and people can kind of disagree or agree as to whether or not he was actually being sexist or not. But Black Lives Matter is a political group, an activist group. And it seems to be a little bit strange for businesses to begin reacting to critical statements from their employees on social media against a political group and not a class of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we're seeing is that companies like to stand for things that are in keeping with their values. And a lot of companies came out when the Black Lives Movement, not when it began, but recently when it escalated. And they wanted to be the first to touch the base and say, hey, wait a second, we want to raise our hand and say, we stand with them. And they, who knows? I mean, I'm speculating, but I guess that you could put it in a favorable light and say, oh, well, they're just such great people. They're just doing these things. Or you could say they're smart business people and they want to make sure that a certain percentage of their customers continue to do business with them. And I think that when they decide what their mission statement is, what their values are, what they stand for, that if an employee does not I don't want to say if an employee doesn't stand with them, but if an employee does something publicly that is opposite of that or detrimental to that or offensive to that, then I think they do have the right to fire them. I could give you a bunch of examples of how it maybe wouldn't be okay if it was pretextual. And, for example, if you had, I don't know, I just think of a crazy example, but if you had 100 people who made the same kind of anti-BLM comments on their Facebook page, but the only people who were fired were the employees that were age 65 and older, then you could say, wait a second, that was a pretext for you to discriminate against your older employees, and that's illegal.
Okay,
right?
So how about this in this scenario? Because I can't imagine what the reaction would be, but I don't think the reaction would be the same. But I could be wrong. Imagine right after one of these mass shootings that people make anti-NRA statements, which they did. Basically, there were quite a few tweets and social media posts essentially aligning the NRA with, complicit in the deaths of children. If somebody forwarded something like that to Delta or any other company, and the company decided to fire the person because they spoke out against the NRA, would the reaction of it being okay from some quarters of the public be the same?
Well, let's take a different example. Let's say Chick-fil-A that is very public about their support of the Trump administration, anti-LGBTQ groups, ultra-right conservative groups, etc. Let's say that they had an employee who posted pictures on Facebook of them marching in a gay pride parade. Well, actually, that's not a good example because the Supreme Court just ruled yesterday on something that could change that. But let's say the person posted on their Facebook page, I think that all Baptists are going to hell. I mean, I'm totally making something up.
Right.
I mean, I think Chick-fil-A could fire that person just to say, you know what? Go work for Wendy's, because you don't reflect the company's values here. So if the company makes a big deal, the company is like, look, we're Koch Industries, and we completely support the NRA, and we support CPAC and all of these things, and you've got an employee who's out there lefty, saying things publicly, then I think they could get fired.
So you think as a legal matter it would be within their purview. I'm not so sure that the American public would be supportive of something like that, or at least the media certainly would be.
Right.
Let me ask you a quick question in terms of, from a legal matter in terms of fairness. And this is what I mean. If we begin to see more companies move in the direction of getting rid of employees either because of past or current tweets against any type of political group that they deem important now, but it doesn't go in the opposite direction. So for simplicity's sake, I'll use left versus right. Obviously, Black Lives Matter is more left. If they don't see, if other employees are making leftward type of arguments, but they're not getting fired for outrageous things as well, does the employee at that moment have a case to go into a lawyer and say, look, they did it to me in this direction, they're not doing it to anybody in that direction?
If the allegation was that it was pretextual firing based upon, and that was a pretext to discriminate against someone who was in a protected class.
Mm-hmm.
Age, race, national origin, things of that nature.
Okay. So, from a business point of view, and as well as legal, the title of my question is both the new McCarthyism. Really, my sense is that we could move into an era where employees are, feel like they're being surrounded by the NSA, if you will.
Right.
Really, just typhus with how they are, because they never know when any particular item, depending on the public whim, could either get them demoted, fired, or what have you. And is that really a good tenable place for businesses to be in, especially large corporations? Because with, Black Lives Matter specifically, in this moment, a lot of corporations are trying to, I would say, jump in alignment with them. But they've set their own incendiary items on, social media, videos, and things like that, and that could end up coming back to bite corporations on the backside as well. And I just imagine myself as a
Right.
I cannot put anything on Twitter or Facebook.
Well, I wouldn't want to be quoted on this because I don't consider myself to be an expert on this, but
Mm-hmm.
it could become very tricky constitutional arguments. If a Black person spoke out in favor of Black Lives Matter, and this was not in keeping with the employer's beliefs, and that person was fired, that person would possibly have a claim that he or she was actually discriminated against on the basis of race. I don't know whether that claim would file or not. If a Black person spoke out publicly and said, I think this BLM thing is a bunch of hooey, and was fired for that, then I think it's not so much about getting fired based upon race. But these are very thin lines that ultimately a court would have to decide.
Mm-hmm.
If a white person said, I think BLM is a bunch of hooey and got fired for that, then they're not being fired based upon their race. They're getting fired because they said something that was considered incendiary, by the employer. But I understand what you're saying, which is, where do we draw the line? And if I work for company A and go to a Trump rally and I post all over my Facebook page me getting in people's faces and yelling at them, and I'm holding up an offensive sign that says, fags are going to hell, and I get fired for that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also get fired for marching in a Black Lives Movement rally and saying cops are pigs and they all ought to die?
Right.
I see what you're saying, but
let me ask you a question that's a little bit more closer to your bailiwick then, and I think a little bit more practical and less political on the business side. I want to take you, I guess, on, in one scenario you're representing the company, in the other scenario you're representing possibly an individual. What do they do? If you're the counsel for a corporation, how do you help them navigate this, what we see as possibly a new era in public accountability or public expectation toward corporations corporations in this particular area?
Well, if I was advising the corporation, I would tell them to have a written policy and make sure that every member of the company knows of it, signs off on it. And I wouldn't make the policy be political in any way. It would be more about the nature of the speech, not your political belief or your opinions. But, you know, regardless if you're saying fags should die and I agree with you, or you're saying cops should die and I don't agree with you, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And in both of those situations, language that is deemed offensive, and define what that means, language that suggests or promotes violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it was me, I would bullet point it, and then I would put a big caveat and say this isn't an exhaustive list, and if there's a question, we're going to err on the side of terminating you or taking action against you, because we really don't want anybody even trying to walk close to the line, because what you do reflects upon the company, and you know, you have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech is different from, I mean, I could put on a white robe and a white hat and walk around town, and that is my right to do that. But if I post on Facebook, look at me walking around here, my employer has the right to say, we don't like you. We don't want to have anything to do with you.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot work here.
Okay. So what about what your advice would be to individuals now, especially ones that are moving into or either moving into or already have high-powered positions? Do they just get off of social media completely? Do they just cannot, moving forward, look at it as a place that they can engage in any sort of political statements? I mean, again, going back to Delta, I mean, I looked at the tweets. The one about Black Lives Matter wasn't even, I mean, I'm not sure if you saw that particular tweet, but it was a retweet of someone else kind of comparing, hey, you know, black on black crime is a bigger problem than white people killing black people, which is a mantra that many prominent African-American conservative commentators have been saying for years.
Well, I think my advice would be to take my father's advice, who's no longer with us. My dad always used to say, your rights end where my nose begins. And so the thing for an employee to be mindful of is that, sure thing, this is America. You have the right to whatever your opinion is, and even if your opinions are repugnant or offensive to others, you know, we live in this world where you can get on Facebook and be the biggest jackass you want to be, and you're not going to get sued for that necessarily. But you don't, unless there are exceptions, such as you have a contract or something like that, in general, most employer-employee relationships are at-will relationships, meaning if your employer does not like you, does not like your opinions, does not like the way in which you're expressing them, you can be fired unless you could prove that this was a subterfuge for discriminating against you based upon some constitutionally protected class. So to answer your question, my advice is that people be mindful of the fact that your employer may be looking at your social media posts, and but you should be careful
The general impression I got from my chat with Kay is that me and you have to be wary because companies have almost free reign at terminating you so long as you're not a member of a protected class. Black Lives Matter is not being seen as an activist group the way that the NRA is. Black Lives Matter is, for all intents and purposes, being viewed as the black community. Criticize them and it's racist because you're actually criticizing black people. Now, these are my words, not Kay's. Her point more than once is that if they, corporations, see it that way and consider criticism of BLM or any other organization as a violation of their company's values, you, as a worker, have little recourse. I also spoke with attorney Michael Smith. Michael is the vice chair of the law firm Cozen O'Connor's Labor and Employment Department and managing partner of the New York Midtown office. Michael had a slightly different take on the road society appears to be on. Here's what he had to say.
Thank you for taking a little time with me today to just answer a few questions about these, where I see some of these things going.
Sure.
Okay.
Happy to talk. I can't, I could speak sort of in kind of general terms. I don't typically, I'm not necessarily going to comment on the specific companies themselves, particularly since, I'm not in the specific companies, but I'm happy to talk about the issues more broadly with you.
Yeah. That's about it. You're using the companies mostly as a kind of, conversation point, but I'm looking more broadly both at possible implications both for individuals, businesses legally, and then kind of moving forward. So kind of start off, when you, I guess you've seen or heard about some of the situations. The Delta's a pretty well publicized one. Chicago Fed and a professor at the University of Chicago is another one who, put out a tweet that was relatively benign, but he was fired as well. What is your general reaction first to situations where they seem to be moving from, these are political and activist type groups that are being criticized as opposed to, protected groups? You follow what I mean?
Yeah. But in some respects, and, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, certain types of political related activities may be protected as well. You have many jurisdictions, such as New York, for example, which have what's referred to as legal activities laws, and they, protect to a certain extent employees engaging in certain types of activities, sometimes recreational, sometimes political, on their own time, off hours, off premises, and in some cases that may be a protected activity. So it's really not that new of an issue. We just seem to, as different kinds of topics become more in the news every year, we seem to have these new platforms for the same kind of issue. And the issue really is, if an employer hears or sees that its employees are doing or saying something that they don't like, are they able to just, discipline them or terminate them? And the real broad answer to that is that employers really shouldn't be knee-jerk in their reactions to what employees are saying and doing, either out in the world or on social media. But they need to analyze the situation on an individual by individual basis and see if anything that's being said or done falls within a protected category, either because it falls within one of these state legal activities laws, or if it falls under the concept of protected concerted activity that we hear so much under the National Labor Relations Act. So it's just important. It's important for employers to look at these on a case-by-case basis to really analyze, what's been done, what's been said, as opposed to just saying, well, I can terminate this person because he or she is an at-will employee and I don't like what they did or said.
Okay. What is the danger here for them reacting from a knee-jerk? Because some of these, the firing came so quick that it just didn't seem that they really had time to really sit down and speak with their own, counsel as to whether or not getting rid of the employee was a smart thing to do.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. I think the danger in being knee-jerk in your reaction is, whether the company has given itself enough time to analyze what's been said or done, and to determine whether you are entitled to take some sort of negative employment action if that's the way you want to go. I think taking the action first, without assessing the risk of doing it is a dangerous thing from the company standpoint, certainly.
Okay. So I think some companies will probably obviously make the argument that, they're at will, or they'll pretend that they are at will, whether they are or not. But what happens if it seems to be going in the one direction? So the example I used with someone else was, we saw what happened or what is happening when they criticize Black Lives Matter. What if someone that was Black Lives Matter or someone who aligned with Black Lives Matter made a opposite comment about, say, the NRA? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly after mass shootings, the NRA has been accused of being complicit with the death of children. If the company decided to get rid of someone like that, even someone who happens to be an employee that's Black, for saying something bad about horrendous about the NRA, and they didn't do anything, but they did something to the employee that said something about Black Lives Matter, what type of kind of snake pit do we get into with that?
Well, there's really three things that I would say in response to that good question. Number one, companies should be careful about getting caught up in the at-will notion. Yes, you may have an employee who's at will in the sense that they don't have a contract for a particular term, so they're an at-will employee, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that, an employer can do whatever it wants and terminate somebody for any reason. There are limitations to at-will employment. Particularly when what a company does violates some other law. Number two, you want to make sure that you're again analyzing the difference between lawful activity and unlawful activity. So what do I mean by that? There may be a situation where an employee starts uttering all kinds of racist or homophobic or sexually hostile comments that, depending on the nature of what is said and the circumstances, they may, as a private employer, you may be entitled to take disciplinary action for engaging in that kind of behavior without running afoul of, legal protections. So again, that goes back to why it's important for companies not to be knee-jerk in their reaction, but to actually analyze and speak with counsel about what was said, what was the context it was said in, and is this protected activity that the employee is engaging in, or did the employee say or do something that somehow falls outside of any legal protection? And then number three is you want to be consistent. You don't want to be a company where you're letting this employee's conduct go, but very similar conduct, albeit engaged by a different demographic, you're coming down hard on and maybe terminating the individual. So you want to certainly be consistent in how you're applying your policies and applying any discipline that results from what's being done.
Okay. So let me kind of look at this from two sides with your legal expertise here. What do companies do moving forward if this trend continues, in which public pressure from people they've never heard from before is brought to bear on employees, not for something that happened recently, but 5, 6, 7 years ago? What kind of new parameters, or if any, are companies going to have to put in place moving forward to deal with this type of thing?
So say that again. I'm not sure I understand the whole question.
Well, it seems like what I mean is what's happening with this cancel culture is it's moving from things that people might say about groups or people to actual political groups or activism groups. And so it seems to me that now companies are moving into a whole new forest, if you will, of things that they have to consider when hiring people, setting up, parameters within the company or how to deal with these things. What's the way forward for companies in this new kind of path that's being forged as we speak right now?
Well, I mean, there's a broad answer to that. I mean, and to me, it comes down to, people. I think it's even more of a reason why it's important for companies if I'm understanding the question right, it's even more important for companies to make sure that they have diverse workforces, make sure that they don't just talk about diversity and inclusion and respectful workplaces on paper, but that, through their communication, through how they implement their policies, and through their training that they give to employees, that, it becomes a company culture where you are promoting diversity and inclusion of your workforce. And I think a lot of it really starts there. And again, it also doesn't just start from the executive suite or even human resources people. It's communications that you have to have, training that you have to do with your frontline managers who are interacting with employees day to day. This really needs to be a cultural understanding of what the workforce and the workplace of 2020 and beyond has to be.
So what about for employees and individuals? I mean, are we moving into an era where you would be literally like the best legal advice is just don't be on social media?
Well, it is definitely tough. It's definitely, we're in a different world now. I don't like to paint with broad strokes. I don't like to say always this or never that. Because used to be that there were definitely lines drawn between work discussion, what you talked about in the office, and, personal lives and non-work related stuff. And look, there's no question that before the internet, before social media, it was easier to maintain those lines. But now, we're bringing politics into the workplace. We're bringing discussions into work. A lot of us aren't just working within four walls. So, we're working on social media and we're commenting on social media. So I think, I don't think you can put your head in the sand and say, nobody should ever be on social media, or that we're going to make absolute rules. I think it comes down to, both for the company and for the individuals, as you said, using good judgment. Using good judgment and respecting your colleagues and the people around you.
Okay. So for anyone that believes that they were being careful and write something relatively benign, and I think the best example would have been, again, the former person that was part of the Fed and worked at University of Chicago Business School, I believe, as a professor. They made a comment basically saying that Black Lives Matter was blowing their moment, so to speak, because of all the other craziness that was coming into the riots, and it was time to move forward. So if they say, hey, I think I said something that wasn't aggressively offensive, that was benign, and now I'm losing my job or I'm getting disciplined in some form of fashion, what's their recourse, so to speak?
Well, if any individual feels that way, they certainly have the right to speak with counsel on their side as well to see what their rights are. At the end of the day, there's going to be a balance between an individual's right to engage in lawful activities, engage in appropriate and lawful speech, versus a company's and employer's right to promote its legitimate business interests and maintain an appropriate workplace. So, where the line is drawn between those two interests will be different in every particular case. But just like, a company, an employer, should consult with counsel to understand the legal nuances of a particular situation. An employee certainly should feel like he or she has the right to do the same thing.
Okay. And then last question, do you have an idea, if you were to cast out the net in the future, where some of these issues are going to be, and what possible solutions might be? Are we going to be seeing a whole new subset of lawsuits that end up going to the Supreme Court in this era, or is it going to be something that gets solved in court because people decide to start trying to sue companies for being let go because they say it was unfair?
Well, I think there's going to be two fronts that we'll see. I think one is the litigation, the lawsuit front. I do think that we'll see, more lawsuits coming out, not just in an increase in terms of discrimination claims and those types of things, but also in the sense of people bringing claims that they were unfairly disciplined or unfairly terminated because they engaged in activity that they believed they were entitled to engage in, when the employer doesn't agree and doesn't believe that they had a right to do so with no consequence. So I think we'll see lawsuits about that. And I also think that we will continue to see the trend that we saw starting really in 2018 and 2019 from a legislative standpoint when it comes to workplace training. We started to hear a whole lot about it in the sexual harassment field, and, talking about mandatory employment and workplace training. I think we'll continue to see efforts to broaden those requirements so that, yes, it's important to talk about sexual harassment still. Yes, it's obviously important to talk about race relations, but it's just as important to talk about the broader notion of diversity and inclusion and a respectful workplace. And I think we will see legislative attempts to broaden training requirements that employers need to engage in with their employees.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
In America, you can pretty much sue for anything. Winning the suit via a settlement or at trial is another question. A question that does not put food on the table or pay your mortgage if your company fires you. If you are a business owner, you have to examine the potential costs to the civil unrest if you are based in a location where riots and looting are occurring, or for not aligning with a political movement. The NFL, Twitter, Walmart, Amazon, and dozens have pledged money to either Black Lives Matter or various other social justice organizations. So far, $200 million in counting has been raised. How will it be spent is another question, and one I'll leave to the political pundits. But a calculation is being made here that doing all this will burnish the company's racial bona fides and maybe make their employees proud. But will it though? Delta Airlines takes pride as being one of the best places to work. Does that remain the case if employees feel as if they cannot live their lives and must be worried about even the most benign comments on social media jeopardizing their livelihoods? In recent years, some people have tried to make the case that the American flag itself is offensive. So will you be able to wear a shirt with a flag on it, even as Black Lives Matter people walk around with their shirts? How far will companies go to appear on the right side, and at what cost? That's the business calculation. Gillette decided to join the woke space with a commercial defending transgenderism and another about toxic masculinity. It cost them money, as their demographic revolted against it. The NFL lost millions of viewers and millions in merchandising sales. The same has happened to ESPN when its shows turned political and leftward. In the wake of the Floyd murder and riots, ESPN has swung to the culturally woke direction again, many arguing that kneeling for the flag and standing for the national anthem, the results so far have not been positive. They're experiencing a 41-year ratings low. It can be tempting to take a stand. And then you have to say, what are your customers going to do? You have to remember that half of them are conservatives. Some of them are police. Black Lives Matter often chant violence against police or white Americans. What do you say about that if it's an employee? The danger of McCarthyism in the 50s was that even the hint of communism leanings could ruin your life and business. Many Hollywood stars were blacklisted for years, even if you weren't a communist. It also chilled any sort of pushback against governmental overreach because you could be accused of being with the communists. If you do not like a group chanting this, then you or your business is racist and must be punished, even if 99% of the country want the cop that killed George Floyd in jail. Mobs are not reasonable. That's why they're called mobs. So for you as an individual, the chilling effect on your speech is here. Your social media probably needs to be scrubbed. If you've made comments about gays, transgender, Black Lives Matter, feminists, etc., it's best to hit the delete button unless you're willing to take the blowback. You'll need to set aside more savings in case the worst happens and something inoffensive sets somebody after you. Kind of sucks because this is America. We have freedom of speech. But social media gives everybody a reach not seen before in the world's history. It is also a double-edged sword because it's a narrow echo chamber, making voices seem louder than they actually may be in real life. Twitter is the prime example here. Twitter has 48 million monthly users in the US. Only 31 million can be monetized. Yet the country has 330 million people. More people don't use Twitter than do. The numbers get even lower as you move into specific groups, but you can feel like it's the whole world when you're on Twitter. The last word on this has to be a caution. Life is a pendulum, swinging in one direction and always swinging back. A reversal, a backlash, a move in the opposite direction is inevitable. Companies will have to remember this. So do institutions. Companies that went full woke lost business, good employees, and public trust. Those that do not might take a short-term PR hit, but will maintain sales and clean up when the pendulum swings in the opposite direction. Thanks for listening to this particular video. Be sure to hit the notification buttons for our next segments. And if you have any comments, likes, or anything else to say, or better yet, questions for any of the people that I interviewed, post them below. I'll be sure to send them off and do a follow-up video as well.